sticking around through that. So, this is me, you can tell, because of the photo. My name is Gemma, my hair is much neater in that photo. What you're about to hear is basically a summary of my master's work. And what I aim to do today is give you a very broad overview of that, and for a general audience kind of level overview. Luckily, Alex has done some of the hard work for me, so I can hark back to that. This is what I worked on. I worked on internet gaming disorder, and my general question was, is this thing, which was proposed to go into the psychiatric manuals, real? That was basically it. I wanted to know whether the work that already existed on it made sense, and whether it was, in fact, a legitimate disorder. So, the first question I start most of my presentations with is a general one. It's, why on earth did you decide to spend this much time talking about gamers? And it's a genuine question. People tend to assume that I was a gamer. And whilst I did enjoy games, particularly in my high school years, that was not why. I actually went to see Dominic. I'm Dominic's student. I went to see Dominic, and I had this very grand idea that I was going to study neuroplasticity and the potentials of the human brain. I'm not sure if Dominic remembers this. But I went and saw him, and he went, "That sounds great. Do you want to work on addiction?" And I went, "Look, that's a different thing." But okay. And then he gave me the driest book in the history of ever, and I read that book on mechanistic models of the brain, and I then read a little bit about addiction and realized that I had a little in, that there was this proposed new addiction called internet gaming addiction, and I had some experience with that. For those of you who have not seen this before, do you recognize this image at all? No. Does anyone know the game World of Warcraft? It's a massive multiplayer online role-playing game. Yes, you do. Well, this image is from a Valentine's Day event that they have in the game. You can meet gamer singles, and you can go to cemeteries, apparently, and connect. I had an ex-boyfriend who was a gamer, and we broke up as a result of his excessive gaming. So what I'm known as in the kind of gamer community is a widow of Warcraft. So that was my in. Now that it's taken me so long to do my thesis, I feel like if my ex found out, that would make me seem obsessive, but I hope he has not. I really just hope he has not. That was my in. And my question really was he addicted? Was this something he couldn't control, or was he just basically, worthy of being broken up with? So, how was I going to go about this? Okay, so my background was actually environmental science and human geography, so I wasn't necessarily naturally inclined towards any particular methodology. And I had done history and philosophy of science, and one of the things I liked about history and philosophy of science is that it's quite interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. This is a methodology image that I created, which was a variation on something from Owen Flanagan and his paper, What Is It Like to Be an Addict? And essentially, the point of this is to say we actually can't answer any questions to do with mental illness unless we think about it from various different perspectives. So for Flanagan, he is a phenomenologist, so he's very interested in the question of what is it like to be an addict. So you'd start with those personal accounts of the experience of addiction, and you go from there. And then for him, he adds in philosophy and neuroscience. Philosophy and psychology. For me, when I started looking at internet gaming addiction, I realized there was a couple of things that were necessary to add to this. One was neuroscience, and to an extent economics. I haven't put economics in here, but economics is very much central to my account. And also game studies. Game studies I'll return to because it's the most neglected part of this story in the literature, and I think it's potentially the most important. So I can answer it by starting as a philosopher. So Flanagan starts here, I'll start here. I'm interested in conceptual questions, and this is how I go about them. So the first part of the question, I'm going to fall over this, the first part of the question for me, as Alex already pointed out, is about addiction. And you might say, it's internet gaming disorder. That terminology has changed. When I started doing this, everyone called it an addiction, and that's still the conceptualization that's used. So, the question immediately is how to conceptualize addiction. Unlike phobias, I would say addiction is very much not a natural kind. It's not one thing. There are different variations of it, and the ways in which you can understand it will give you explanations for the different kinds of addiction. So addiction to cocaine, addiction to opiates, addiction to cannabis, whatever it is you're interested in. But in general, we would say addiction is this term that can be used in different ways. It describes intense engagement or persistent use. And I really like the term engagement. When anybody uses addiction in a kind of lightweight sense, I usually say, engagement, not addiction. And so in a general sense, it can cover anything you just really like to do. But for psychiatrists, that's not particularly interesting. We're more interested in, or philosophers of psychiatry are interested in it as a clinical term. So how it describes disordered use in various forms. And there's got to be a way for distinguishing between just things we like to do, behavioural regularities, and things that are pathological, or behavioural regularities that have exceeded normal use in an important way. So, as I said, there's plenty of different ways to think about that. You can think about it in terms of problems with your prefrontal cortex. You can think about it in terms of problems with society. You can think about it in terms of problems with dopamine, a whole bunch of stuff. What I was interested in was what was the best model in order to apply it to the IGD case. Enter gambling. So I spent a lot of my thesis talking about gambling. Excuse me. And it was really centered around a particular piece of work. I wrote a very central book to my thesis, which is called Midbrain Mutiny, the Pico-economics and Neuroeconomics of Disordered Gambling. The basic idea is that if you combine what we know from neuroscience and psychology with economics at both levels, you'll produce a really nice account of disordered gambling. And it will distinguish between two groups of people. A group that is disordered, as in they all have the kind of same symptom pools, but they're engaging in poker machine use or what have you to an extent that's problematic in some way, but they don't have something going on necessarily at the neural level. Excuse me. And another group that has exactly that, plus this neural stuff. And the reason economics comes in is because neurons are perfect economic agents, as it turns out. So when you combine the economics in with the neuroscience, you can give this account which says it's all about neurons fighting for glucose, essentially. And then that leads you up to the dopaminergics kind of stuff. You hear dopamine being talked about a lot in terms of addiction. But then you have to combine that with behavioural economics to understand behaviour. And this works really well for gambling because gambling describes exactly what happens to the brain separate to any substance. This is the only quote I have in this, so bear with me. It says, gambling is the fundamental case of addiction because the reward system stumbles on a way to naturally pair reliable cueing with supplies. Addictive gambling demonstrates what it is about the brain itself as opposed to the brain plus a special exogenous chemical that gives rise to the potential for addiction. Thus, addictive gambling is the window to the heart of the general addictive syndrome. The claim here is that gambling is really beautiful in a sense because it's not about what alcohol is doing to the brain in terms of causing any kinds of dementia-like characteristics. It's not about whether ice is impacting on amygdala function. It's not about any of that stuff. It's about the brain changing itself in relation to cues in the environment. So, given that IGD is a behaviour, this is a behaviour too, it seems most likely that you would look to gambling, and this is exactly what people have done, look to gambling and say, okay, is IGD like gambling? So, on to IGD. This is not a new question. This question has been asked since, I'd say, the early 1990s, when people started to get very worried about kids playing video games mostly in video game parlors. They were worried about that. And then once it became an online thing, then people started to get very concerned about it. I've included a picture here from a game called Overwatch because Overwatch has these loot boxes which are really like gambling tasks, and it's a very clear indication that maybe this will work. So, where do we start? This becomes a battle of who can get it in the psychiatric manual first. Really did. The DSM-5 sort of won. Sort of. I think the ICD-11 won in the end. Prior to 2013, there's a bunch of different terms that people are using for this disorder. Problematic internet use, internet addiction, disordered internet use. There's every time someone produced a new paper, they came up with a new term. When the DSM-5 was in its revision process, so prior to 2013, they set up a task group to look at behavioural addiction. Or actually, they set up a task group to look at addictions in general. And they decided first that gambling should be included in taken out of impulse control disorders, otherwise not classified, and moved into addiction. They brought back the word addiction, they hadn't had it in there for a while, and they started to think of them all the same. Then they started to look at internet gaming, and actually they looked at the internet first and decided that that's a silly thing to say. You can't be addicted to the internet. That's like saying you'd be addicted to a casino, right? It's too big a category. So they thought, look, evidence isn't quite there yet, we'll put it in an appendix. They put it in the appendix for further research, but they outlined what this disorder was going to look like, and it looked a lot like addiction. Right? So the symptoms list like addiction. The evidence that's used to justify putting that in that appendix is all from Southeast Asia, and there's no doubt it will be in the next revision of the DSM. At the end of last year, the International Classification of Diseases decided it wanted in on the action, and so it put it straight in. It didn't even go into an appendix. There was a large outcry about this in the literature. Lots of people have a problem with this being in there, but they're a pragmatically oriented psychiatric manual, and so they said, nope, there's people in need, it needs to go in here. They actually advertised it on Facebook saying, you might have a disorder, just so you know, for gaming, watch out. And so that was published this year. I think that was way too early. Our understanding of IGD is terribly limited, and it's limited partly because it's conceptualized so crappily, but partly because it's just a very complex thing. The current research pool that we have is heterogeneous, it's complex. Basically because prior to 2013 you didn't even have a single term, any of the research that's done before that needs to be heavily critiqued, and it hasn't necessarily been so. And also gaming is just very complex. For anyone who's not a gamer, it might surprise you to find out that not all games and not all gamers are the same. And so there's this huge scope of what you can do in games, what kind of games exist, what people like to do even within single games. And there's also a very broad spectrum of gamers. So one of the things that I noticed was that a lot of these studies were done on a specific group of people. At a guess, anyone know who the focus of research would have been on? Anyone? Yeah.
First year undergraduates?
Oh, no. Although that would have also worked. No. Do you reckon they're male or female? Male. You think they're teenagers or adults? Teenagers. Right. Adolescent males. Most of the studies were on adolescent males. Now that would be perfectly okay if that wasn't highly problematic. So one of the problems with that is that the average age of a gamer is in their 30s, not 17 or 16 or 15. And about 40% of gamers are women. So they've just been ignored completely. In fact, I read a paper quite recently that said, look, all this research shows that boys and men in general are more likely to have this disorder, so it must be a male disorder. I was like, or all the research is done on men. I mean, like, you know, either or. So that's a big problem for the research. It's not reflected critically. And it also suggests that there's this group of teenagers who could have an addiction. What other thing would we say was addictive when we're only 15? If I hear of a 15-year-old who's drinking a lot, I might say that is a problem, but I tend not to call them addicts at that point. The reason is they're in a developmental stage, right? They can't necessarily control their behavior, so that seems normal. Another problem is to do with comorbidity. Comorbidity is the existence of other disorders alongside the disorder of interest. So addiction is known for having a high comorbidity with other disorders. A lot of different things. In terms of internet game disorder, it's depression, anxiety, ADHD, the big one, and social phobias, stuff like that. So whilst there's this minority of game players that do experience these symptoms, they tend to have a lot of other symptoms as well. And then it becomes a question of cause, because if you take the case of the adolescent male, then you have someone who might be socially isolated or worried about social situations, experiencing some depression as a result of like their context or just the fact that they're an adolescent male. And the fact that they're gaming a lot isn't necessarily the problem, right? And that, one of the things I've noticed in the literature is that they basically go, oh, it's highly comorbid with other disorders, therefore it's its own disorder. I'm like, what? Hang on, no. You have to go, it's highly comorbid with other disorders, maybe it's a symptom itself. So I have pointed that. Most problematically is that if we thought that IGD was a coherent concept, we'd expect that gamers were doing the same thing. This is about behavioural regularities. We'd expect them to be engaging in the same behaviour, right? And we'd expect it to be at least similar enough. And that's just not the case. Gamers do all sorts of different things. They engage in creative tasks, they engage in like kind of escapist tasks, they do grinding tasks, they work together, they solve problems, they do puzzles, they build cities, they like design artworks, they write stories. There's so many things that gamers do that suggesting that this is this behaviour regularity, that everyone's just engaging in the same thing, and then judging use based on something like time. So we say, well, the game's been playing for X amount of time, therefore they're addicted. That's a big problem. if there's one thing that philosophers can do really well, it's state the obvious, and that's basically what I've done. That's essentially my thesis. Games and gamers just aren't that simple. And to reduce them down to this singular homogeneous entity is incorrect. The field that deals with this so utterly clearly is game studies, and it just gets ignored over and over again in the research. And they stand up and go, this is not, you're ignoring us, and everyone just ignores them. So my method reflected that by putting game studies at the forefront. So, it took me a really long time to finish this thesis, so here's my conclusions. The literature needs to do better. Here's your ad, actually. I'm going to put that in. That's the World Health Organization ad that I've been tagged in literally maybe 50 times on Facebook saying, hey Gemma, have you seen that they're adding it to ICD? I'm like, yeah, I spent 9 years studying this, so yes, I have. So what is this? Yeah, what is the summary? Game studies needs to be incorporated into IGD experimental design. I can talk about it later if you want. I had some ideas, specific ideas about what actual tasks you should be looking at and how you could better reflect that in experimental design. And oversimplification should be avoided at all costs. I think that that's a general point you could make about any psychiatric disorder. And I just want to make a note, because this comes up a lot in questions and things. I don't deny that some small subsection of players do experience issues, but I also am very concerned that classifying games as addictive might actually be harmful because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy thing. I gave a presentation at a games design class on social aspects of gaming, and right at the end of the presentation, someone shot their hand up and said, hey, I just played the latest version of whatever game it was, can't remember, and I played it for 4 days straight without doing anything else. Am I addicted? Of all the questions you could have asked me, but I just said, but did you have fun? Was this something that you enjoyed in life? Was this something, and he was just like, yeah, it was a freaking fantastic game. Like, well, there's your answer. Like, games shouldn't be seen as necessarily problematic. They can be amazing things, actually. I wish that I would have ended in a different position than that, because I would have really liked to say that my ex was addicted, but I'm not. That one. So that was my general conclusion, that we have to be a lot more careful about the way that this is put together, and I have some ideas about that, and thanks.